Can a human player beat traction control on F122? So traction is a lot more critical on this year's F1 game, then much more so than in previous years. It's now a lot easier to spin your tyres and even spin out, certainly lose some traction. So that begs the question, is it now better to run traction control? Is it even possible to match traction control levels of grip without traction control? Well, today we're going to find out. Let's get into it. So to run this test then, we need to isolate as many variables as we can because we only want to test the assist. So we don't want to simulate temperatures or tyre wear or anything like that. So we're going to run it in time trial, which basically gets rid of most of that simulation stuff. We're also going to test between 100 and 150 kilometers an hour. The reason we're not starting at 0 is because it's really hard to figure out when the car starts. But obviously using the on-screen display, we can see when that number ticks over to 1 really easily. So it's a much more precise starting point. And the reason we've chosen 150 kilometers an hour for the limit is because that's roughly when the traction limited tires stop. So at that point, you're no longer traction limited. We're also going to be using Spain, and we're going to be starting from pole position in an exact position that you'd ideally want to start at Spain. And of course, we have got all other assists off. Well, technically speaking then, I am running the game at 120 FPS, and I'm also recording the video at 120 FPS. It's important for it to be locked to that because, of course, we're not actually counting time or speed, we're actually counting frames, number of frames. So it's really important that that's really consistent and as high as possible. I couldn't record any higher than 120, so that gives us a accuracy of something like 100th of a second. So these measurements are accurate to within 0.01 of a second, more or less. I'm also running the Fanatec GT Pro, and of course I am on PC. So let's jump straight on in then. The first test is going to be to get some sort of benchmark. So I'm going to be running the full high traction control setting in the assists. I did 7 of these attempts and they're all actually very consistent. All give me just over 4 seconds, 1 to 150 kilometers an hour time. Again, super consistent. I guess that's not a surprise when you're just slamming on the throttle and letting the traction control deal with it. It's all just computerized. And that gives us an average of 4.042 seconds with an absolute best time of 4.025. So pretty damn similar. I mean, our worst was 4.067, so pretty damn similar. Not a surprise, but that gives us a good benchmark. Just over 4 seconds when the traction control completely all the way turned up to high. Next up then, I turned the traction control down to medium settings, and the first thing to do was do the exact same thing with the pedal, which is just absolutely throttle at the start. That gives you a load of wheel spin at the start on medium traction control, and it's not till about, I don't know, something like 60 or 80 kilometers an hour where the traction control actually really starts kicking in. So that actually slowed down our 1 to 150 kilometers an hour time to around about 4.2 seconds. I only tried this twice, but that gives a pretty definitive answer. It is slower just to floor the throttle on medium traction control than it is high, but not a surprise with the wheel spin we're getting at the start. Next then, of course, was to actually try and manage the throttle pedal. Now, we only need to manage the throttle, again, to around about, 50, 60, 70 kilometers an hour, something like that. Then we can floor it, because at that point, the traction control system takes over. But this then straight away started to yield some results, and eventually we ended up with the best time of 3.725 seconds and an average of 3.891. Quite a bit better than the high traction control. Not a huge surprise. There's a little bit of skill involved, so it's not perfect. We saw quite a big, much bigger variance in the minimum and maximum times compared to high traction control. Unsurprising as now there's some skill involved with trying to minimize the traction. So we saw about half a second variance between the slowest and the biggest, but overall certainly improvement. So that's our baseline figure now for medium traction. That's the figure we're going to go off. We're going to try and beat 3.725 seconds, 1 to 150 kilometers an hour time. Next then, of course, we're going to be turning the traction control off. Now, the first test was just to absolutely throttle the throttle, just like we did at the start of the medium traction control test. We found that obviously slowed us down, but again, not by a crazy amount, to be fair, considering we were wheel spinning all the way up to the 150 kilometer an hour limit. We only saw about times of about 4.4 seconds, only about 0.2 of a second slower than running medium traction control, which is a bit of a surprise to me. I genuinely expected it to take a lot longer to get to that 150 kilometers an hour, but obviously it is still slower. So that was just a bit of a sanity test there. But again, quite consistent actually. There's only about 1/10 of a second between the slowest and the fastest time of these 3 attempts I did. Next up then, we're going to still be trying no traction control, still flooring at the start, but this time we're going to try starting in a higher gear. So we're starting in 2nd gear, and then eventually we'll try starting in 3rd gear as well. Interestingly, this actually slowed down the times, and my reasoning for this is that actually the wheels are actually spinning faster. You're hitting the rev limiter no matter what. The wheels are actually spinning faster, so you've actually got less grip because the the speed of the wheel is a bigger difference to the speed of the ground effectively. There's a bigger delta between the two, so we actually had less grip when we short shift in this way with flooring it. So we saw the best time of this of 4.5 seconds. Doesn't really matter too much of the times in that, but interesting there that short shifting didn't actually help us because the wheels were actually spinning faster. Next up was to take it a little bit more seriously. This time we're actually going to be trying to manage the throttle pedal and get the best start we possibly can without running traction control. I struggled a little bit with this at first, perhaps unsurprising as I've just been flooring it, and of course I hadn't really done any practice before this either. So it took me a little while to get under 4 seconds, but we did eventually get under 4 seconds, and actually our 4th attempt at this ended up being our best time of 3.742 seconds, slightly slower than on medium traction control. Most interesting though is the average times. We're at 4.1 seconds average without traction control, and the medium traction control average time was 3.9 more or less seconds. So around just over 0.2 of a second on average slower to go from 1 kilometers an hour to 150 kilometers an hour without traction control. That's not a surprise. Obviously, it's much more skill based when you're not running traction control. So it's so much easier to make a little mistake, get a bit too much wheel spin, and suddenly that's 0.2 out the window straight away. I actually only had 3 attempts where I got under 4 seconds, whereas on medium traction control, I had, of my 8 attempts, I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times I was under 4 seconds, and of my 14 attempts without traction control, only 3 times under 4 seconds. So clearly it is much harder to get a quick time, and certainly you'll be more consistent on medium traction control. That's probably not a surprise. But in terms of outright speed then, we were actually very slightly slower, but only by around about not even 2/100ths of a second. And I'm sure given more time or given the talent of an esports driver, I could probably, emphasis on probably, beat the medium traction control because we're so close, and I'm sure there's probably ways to improve. Speaking of ways to improve then, we also tried short shifting without traction control on to see if that would help us at all. I thought perhaps there might be something in the code that literally helps you. I mean, the obvious fact is that short shifting dulls the power of the engine, so in theory it should be easier to manage traction control. But in theory, you've still got the same tyres. In theory, physics-wise, there should be no actual advantage to short shifting. It should just make you a bit more consistent and make it a bit easier to manage that traction, but the actual grip from the tyre should be identical. And that's exactly what we found. Our best time was actually very slightly slower, around about 0.04 of a second slower than without short shifting, but again, I'm sure I probably could have matched it given a bit more time. I tried this 11 times all in all, and a lot more of these times though I was under 4 seconds. The average was much lower. The average with short shifting was 3.911 seconds, while the average without short shifting was 4.1. So almost exactly 0.2 of a second on average slower to not short shift. So definitely short shifting, although the actual peak time wasn't as good, it definitely seems that short shifting helps you be more consistent, again just because it dulls the power for you. So I think when you're in, let's say, first gear or even second gear, and you're at the peak power range, a very small movement in the throttle pedal or the trigger if you're on a pad will make quite a big difference in power, whereas if you're short shifting to third or fourth gear, that same amount of pedal travel will have less power jump. So let's say, I don't know, 5% throttle pedal travel while you're in second gear and at the peak power range might add, I don't know, 50 horsepower, let's say. If you short shifted though at the exact same speed, exact same parameters, but if you've short shifted to fourth gear, that same 5% pedal travel might only be 10 horsepower, 20 horsepower. So you can see it's just less sensitive, and it's a lot easier to try and find the limit. But for now, we're going to concentrate on the 2 best times. That wasn't a short shifted time, so we're going to concentrate on the no short shift, no traction control best of 3.742 seconds versus the medium traction control best of 3.725 seconds. We're going to look at them side by side now to see exactly where it is I'm getting those 200ths of a second, and if possible we think we can improve somewhere without traction control. Okay, so here we go. We're going to get even more technical than before. This is actually my editing software. It's the best way to control everything frame by frame. I've also got a frame counter here. So remember, we're on 120 frames per second. So it should mean there's about 480 frames over the course of these 2 launches. We've got them side by side here. We've got the medium traction control on the left and the no traction control on the right. And what we've done is we've split it up into 10 kilometer an hour chunks. So we're going to measure them 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30 kilometers an hour, etc., etc., to see exactly where it is that the medium is getting that slight advantage, and if there's perhaps somewhere we think we can improve on the non-traction control. So let's get straight on into it then. So we've synced them up at the beginning to both be, this is the first frame where they've ticked over to 1 kilometer an hour. So at this point, they're perfectly synced. We're not going to change the sync at all. This is going to stay as it is. So as we cycle through here, you can see the first to get to 10 kilometers an hour is, hopefully, there we go, the traction control. And meanwhile, the non-traction control is only at 8 kilometers an hour. So there's clearly a launch difference there. Now that's interesting because in theory, they're both manual launches. Meaning traction control, if you floor it, you get wheel spin at the start. So you see there we're using quite a similar throttle amount, but I actually think we ended up using a tiny bit more. If we go back to maybe sort of 5 kilometers an hour, I think we ended up using a tiny bit less actually power on the non-traction control, and that was why. So I think there was a little bit more leeway I had there. I could have launched slightly better to 10 kilometers an hour without traction control. So we are now already 3 frames behind without traction control. If we now move on to the 20 kilometer an hour speed, as we tick over to 20, you can see there though, the non-traction control is actually caught up slightly. So I'm actually still managing the traction here, as you can see, but I've just pressed the pedal a little bit harder on the non-traction control, but not enough to make it wheel spin. So that's now doing 19 kilometers an hour, so now we're only 1 kilometer an hour behind, and we're now 4 frames behind actually. But again, the frames aren't perfect because occasionally you do get repeated frame. Going up to 30 kilometers an hour then, and as you can see here, they're actually now level. In fact, the non-traction control is now ahead. I had a massively better 20 to 30 kilometer an hour speed without traction control than I did with. Quite a bit as well. How many frames was it? So that took us 35 frames there, and it only took us 30 frames. 5 frames quicker without traction control to get from 20 to 30 kilometers an hour. Quite a big difference there. Let's go on then to 40 kilometers an hour. And as you can see, we're now back to being absolutely level. They are now dead level as much as I can measure it to within 100th of a second to within 1 frame of a second at 120 FPS. They are now level. So 0 to 40 kilometers an hour in these tests is absolutely identical. We're going to move on then to 50 kilometers an hour, and now you start to see that I'm now pressing the pedal, the throttle a little bit harder with traction control, sorry, because now the traction control is starting to kick in and I can press it a little bit harder, which is why you now see the non-traction control time just dip behind slightly by around about 4 frames, I believe. Yeah, 4 frames difference from 40 to 50. So that's really where I start losing out because, again, that's really where the traction control starts to kick in, I think. And also, I'm probably being a bit too cautious, to be honest, without traction control on the right-hand side. Let's skip ahead then to 60 kilometers an hour. And you can see there, we're now 2 kilometers an hour behind once again. And we've just lost another frame. So it just takes another 5 frames now. We're now 5 frames behind at that point. Let's give it then to 70 kilometers an hour. Where are we? There we go, 70 kilometers an hour. Again, the traction control is on 70, non-traction's at 68, and that one's actually absolutely identical up to 70 kilometers an hour. So we're now getting the same. You can see here we're definitely using more throttle with the traction control on the left than we are on the right. That's not a surprise, I guess. And we now get to the point of flooring the traction. So we now are fully confident the traction control system has got it, and we just floor the throttle. But we're still having to modulate the throttle on the right-hand side, of course. Up to 80 kilometers an hour then. Once again, 78. And we actually saw there, interestingly, from 70 to 80 kilometers an hour, the non-traction control actually clawed it back by 1 frame. So despite the fact we've gone full throttle within that, the non-traction control was actually slightly quicker. But again, it's only 1 frame. It's not a perfect system. Going from 80 to 90 kilometers an hour then, you see on the right side, we're only 1 kilometer behind now, and 80 to 90 kilometers an hour, again, non-traction control actually clawed back 2 more frames. So we're actually clawing things back now without traction control. I think now we're sort of coming to a point where the traction control systems aren't perfect in the game on purpose. You know, if they always got the exact perfect amount of traction, they would be OP because it's just not humanly possible to get perfect traction. Even if you're an esports player and you're within 2% of the absolute limit of traction, which would be insane accuracy, you'd still get beaten by someone that's running traction control. So they purposely make traction control not perfect, just like it is in real life. So I think that's what we're starting to see now. So I'm actually managing the traction better than the traction control system, but the traction control system is still doing it very, very well. So at this point, we are we're only 2 frames behind now without traction control. From 90 to 100 kilometers an hour then, we're once again very, very similar, and that we actually do that identical. 90 to 100 was absolutely identical, the exact same number of frames, 27 frames to be precise. 100 to 110, We are 29 frames with traction control, but 30 without it. So we actually lose another frame there. But again, 1 frame here or there, there's definitely some vagaries with the measurements there. But 3 frames is the difference between the two there. From 110 to 120, absolutely identical again, 25 frames apiece. So we're still 3 frames behind on the right-hand side there. But obviously, that is not a lot at all. 120 to 130, we actually see the traction control now gain 3 frames on us between 120 and 130. Quite a big difference, actually. So we're now 6 frames apart. So on the left there, the medium traction control has just reached 130. On the right, we're now only at 128. You can see that I'm still not quite at full throttle on the right side. I'm still trying to manage the traction just a little bit. And it takes us, there it is, 6 frames now. We're behind. The non-traction control is behind by 6 frames compared to traction control. So again, because we're still traction limited, we're still not quite full throttle there. I know we've been talking for this for multiple minutes. It feels like we've been ages. We're still only, maybe 2 seconds into it or so. Maybe a bit more than that, more like 3. So from 130 to 140 kilometers an hour then, 130 to 140. Actually, we now see the non-traction control start to claw some back. So now we're getting to the point where we're almost not traction limited. And again, the traction control system is always going to be a little bit more cautious than the human player. So we actually just claw back 3 frames there. So we're now only 3 frames behind without traction control. And then, of course, we're measuring in these tests from up to 150. So as we go from 140 to 150, we get our final result, which we already knew. And the non-traction control claws back 1 more frame there to put it just 2 frames behind at 120 frames per second. Not a lot at all. And as you see, when the traction control, medium traction control, reaches 150, we're doing 149 kilometers without traction control. So there's 1 kilometer an hour in it. It is absolutely nothing at all. What was it? 2/100ths of a second. It is such a tiny amount that honestly, you probably wouldn't really even notice it. If you were side by side on the grid and you both launched, you probably wouldn't even notice this difference, to be completely honest with you. But interestingly, if we take it past our previous measurements from 150 up to 160, once again, we see the non-traction control just claw back another frame. I feel like the traction control, again, it's only 1 frame, but I feel like the traction control limits you up to 150 to 160 kilometers an hour. And at that point, there's no traction control. From this point onwards, from 160 kilometers an hour onwards, there's nothing. So it doesn't matter whether you're in traction control or not, as long as you're in a straight line, of course, and lots of other factors as well, rain and things like that. But at that point, at 160 kilometers an hour, we're only 1 frame at 120 frames per second behind without traction control versus with traction control. So we actually claw back another frame. So there we go then, guys. We got pretty damn technical at the end there. I hope you guys stuck with it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video as well. But basically, the answer is, well, in this video, we didn't get a better launch than traction control. Is it possible? I would say so, yes. Purely because at the end of that little sequence there, we saw that we were able to gain at 120 to 130, 140 kilometers an hour, which I believe is the point where traction control starts holding you back. That being said, I will say, I think I can normally get to top 1 or 2% on the time trial leaderboard. So if we assume I'm top 1 or 2% in the world, who knows if that's a safe assumption or not, but if we assume that, I'd say that despite being a top 1 or 2% player in the world, traction control is more consistent than me. I suppose that's not a surprise, but in terms of launches, I was able to be a lot more consistent with traction control, despite having to be a bit careful at the start. So overall, I would actually say that traction control is probably a little bit too OP on F122. Not by much, because you are probably, emphasis on probably because I didn't actually do it, able to beat traction control. I just wasn't able to do it, and I was able to be a lot more consistent with traction control. But interesting nonetheless, and there would certainly be other situations where you probably would be able to be a bit better than traction control, I'd say, certainly on corner exits and things like that. If you're still trying to turn the car, you can probably be a bit better. And also, obviously, you've got a bit more, you can rotate the car, you can use a bit of throttle to get the car slightly sliding, which sometimes helps you in certain situations as well. So overall, I would say esports players are faster without traction control than with traction control. An esports player, they're at the same pace, one with traction control, one without. How close would they be? Honestly, I think they'd be damn close. Within a 10th or 2. I think they'd be very, very close. But anyway, guys, that's enough waffle for today. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more analysis like this in the future, and I'll catch you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.